Hi, I'm Leanpub from Leanpub, and in this episode of the Front Matter podcast, I'll be interviewing Luca Minudel. Based in London, Luca is a consultant, advisor, and mentor in agile, lean, and complexity, serving teams, managers, senior leaders, and executives. He has over 20 years of experience in professional software delivery and digital product development, most of them with lean and agile. You can follow him on Twitter at luca.net and check out his website at smharter.com. Luca is the author of the Leanpub book, Succeed Over Difficult Problems by Embracing Complexity Thinking, Guide to Thriving in Everyday Complexity by Breaking Free from Ordered and Linear Approaches. In the book, Luca provides a micro guide to complexity thinking for anyone who is faced with solving complex problems and is struggling to find the crux of the matter with the help of the current approaches alone. In this interview, we're going to talk about Luca's background and career, professional interests, his book, and at the end, we'll talk a little bit about his experience as a writer. So thank you very much, Luca, for being on the Leanpub Front Matter podcast.
You're welcome. I'm happy to be here.
I always like to start these interviews by asking people for their origin story. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about where you grew up and how you found your way into a career, into the career that you built for yourself.
Yeah, I'm Italian and I come from a small town in the north of Italy. It's called Conegliano. More recently, maybe known to many due to the wine. It's a Prosecco area at the center of the Prosecco area, and it is very close to Venice and Treviso. It is really a small town. Well, like many teenagers at that time, I got into personal computing. I bought one of the first home computers, and that is where all it started, really. It all started from there.
What was the computer?
My first one was a ZX Spectrum. Less than 4 megahertz, 8 kilobyte of memory. Sounds like retro computing now. For the young generation, they may have seen one of those if they are watching, I don't know, Stranger Things type of TV series for that thing. But that was my time. That is when things started.
Yeah, and actually, that's curious. This podcast, because so many of our guests are sort of have some experience programming and things like that. It's a bit of a time capsule of sort of like when people first started learning. And so I think it's interesting that we often reflect on the kind of power of the computers that we had when we first started, and maybe we didn't have the internet or anything like that at the time. But it's actually learning to program is actually one of the biggest differences between those different times. So how did you learn how to program?
Well, first, there were not many games when I received the home computer. There was a manual and how to program it. So that was I could do with it. Start to learn programming the computers, start to make it do something interesting. And soon after, I start to find some magazine where I could read and learn about what other people were doing, then some books, and that's how it started, really. And that was the beginning of the personal computer revolution. You were given a tool where you could create your own product or game by yourself. And it's, in a sense, it's not that far from now with artificial intelligence is a new explosion of innovation.
Yeah, that's a really good analogy, actually. The sense of both foreboding and fun that come from something that's truly transformative and new, and that you can interact with. Like in this, and it's true. I actually haven't thought of that before, but the same delight that I've heard so many people express at like typing some instructions into a keyboard onto a machine and then having it do something. Is the same thing that people express now with the AI chatbots and things like that. That you can just kind of try different things and have the output come for you from what you've done, and it's just a really magical thing.
Yeah, and in a sense, I'm talking about computer programming, but it's also connected to the book and the topic complexity. Think about that fast increase of speed, acceleration of innovation, exactly that sense that you say. We were used to a radio, to a television, being a passive viewer, and suddenly we could make things happen on the screen. that looks like incredible. I'm putting things on the screen of my television, and I'm using a keyboard, and something that makes sense come back. And it's exactly like you say, like with AI, the same sense of incredulity and joy.
And so I'm just looking at your LinkedIn profile here. So did you study computer science when you sort of eventually sort of found your way to university and
Yes, yes. Well, first I played many years with my personal computers. Then when I went into secondary school, I chose one that had a specialization in computer programming. I have to wait 2 years. Then I went there. But funny things, initially, I knew more than some of my teachers, at least the first one on the basic courses. And yeah, that's how I started. And then I started to get the formal education and learn much more. I had some very smart teachers that they were teaching me things ahead of time. So um, think about that. I studied on the book relational databases, and then when I went to work to pay my university, I was working on one of the first commercial databases on a VAX digital machine. And that was one of the first implementation of a relational database. And I knew how to deal with that because of what I studied at school, thanks to a forward-thinking professor and teacher.
one of the questions that comes up on this podcast all the time when we're talking about this sort of experience someone had learning computers for the first time, studying if they went to university, is if you were starting out now, let's say you just turned 18, you graduated from high school, it's 2024, and you wanted to have a career like the one you've had, would you go to university?
I will say yes. It is it is strange. After school, I tried to took a different path. At school, I really developed I got very strong foundation, theoretical foundation. Computer science was a branch of math. And think about that. We started to create a computer, starting to define what is a number, what can you do with numbers, and what are you doing? Does it really make sense? Sets and so on, in order to define a grammar, an interpreter, an execution, all in terms of theory and mathematical structure. So uh, I got a very strong theoretical foundation, and I think that on average, I was at the end of the scale with the habit of dealing with abstraction, almost like a philosopher. But then, and that influenced, in a sense, even my personality. And then it came a time in my life when I wanted to go in a completely different direction, like life that is messy, and when you deal with customers and when you have to deal with the real problems when developing software, dealing with users, with customers, and all the problems around that constantly change in a changing world. And so I went in a completely opposite direction. Instead of the perfect math, the messy life. And I like the journey that I did. I wouldn't change that. I like those two sides and bringing them together.
Yeah, and they definitely come together in complexity science and complexity thinking, which we'll get to pretty soon. But and this connection of the kind of theoretical abstraction to the kind of messy world is something you had a very direct experience with for a few years, in many different contexts, but one that I know you've spoken about quite a bit, working on the Ferrari F1 team on the software side of things. And I was wondering if you could talk a little, and I know this is partly the origin of your interest in complexity and extreme programming and things like that and Agile, but could you talk a little bit about that experience? I mean, how did you get hired to the Ferrari F1? If someone's aspiring to get hired to the F1 team for Ferrari, how do they do that?
Oh, I really don't know. I was in the right place at the right time with the right knowledge. So I think two elements played there. I was learning new software technology. That was the one that the Formula One team was using. And I was getting pretty early in agile software development. So if you think about Formula One is a pretty fast-paced and chaotic environment. You have a race every week or two. The car is constantly developing throughout the championship. Every time you see the car, same colors, same drivers, but there are so many new things going on at every race. And the same thing is for software. And if you try to release something new, that's what we did for every race and even for every test event, it can get very messy. It's easy to try to cut corners. It's easy, like in your car, to try to go too fast and crash. It's very hard to reach the limit, stay on course, and get out with the fastest lap. And that's why the responsible of software development was getting into chaos theory and agile software development. Since I was, as I told you, I got into agile software development quite early, and I randomly handed in a forum about the technology, software development technology they were using. I got a phone call that invited me to an interview. So that's how it got. I was completely surprised.
That's just an amazing story. I'm sorry, I'm a bit distracted because it reminded me of a friend of mine who was once sort of extolling the virtues of NASA, and the next day got a call that they were interested in hiring him, and it's just amazing how those things can happen. But I want to go into this a little bit because it's sort of just so inherently interesting, but also sort of an example of the lived reality of complexity and the way it can combine with sort of programming and stuff. But so. You actually had to sometimes revert code bases during races. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what you're running code on during a race, and why you might need to revert, and how you can do that at all without breaking everything.
Well, the challenge when I joined when I joined the team, I was given the challenge to try to go faster without breaking making things safer. And one of the key things when you try to do that is reversibility. So you can accelerate, go fast, but if something goes wrong, like your computer, you would like to shut it down, restart it as if nothing has happened. And at some point, we try to do that with software. We start to make very small new releases, very small version, and keeping track of which version was stable. Based on we used that before on a test event, on a race event, everything went fine. So we marked the stable version, and we dare to release new versions. But then at any time that there was a showstopper problem, we had automatic scripts that could revert the software version, the database version in real time. The software was running mainly at the pit wall. When you see all the nice people with the fancy dresses looking at monitors, in the motorhome behind with other people doing more work at computers or on the radio. In the own factory, there is also software on the car, but cannot be reversed inside the car. That cannot be done for safety reason. So you simply have automated script that do the change. And the most difficult part is not running the script. When you do that, all the hard work is done. Is making sure that you don't have changes that break compatibility. Think about it's like if your train station change a ticket and you cannot roll back to the old ticket with the old format that the machine doesn't realize. But when you update your technology, sometimes you are in that situation and you have to find out a way in order not to cut yourself out from the ability to roll back. Otherwise, you are in a difficult situation. And because of that, even every day, even before the last day, available date before releasing or making a change, we could push ourselves to the limit because there was reversibility. Any mistake could be reversed quickly and without cost. And because of that, we could always run fast and take risks because we could reverse safely.
Yeah, that's such a fascinating approach to things, and so difficult to achieve. I've had Dave Farley on the podcast before, talking about continuous
There you
delivery and
go.
things like that. And this idea of like going faster and safer at the same time. It's just it's very interesting because a lot of people, when they might be thinking about like sort of programming and development, they'll think about apps and things like that. But when you're doing things like working on like stock trading systems and things like that are all happening in real time, live, with like a lot at stake. The idea that the software kind of just works has a lot of, has a lot of theory behind it. Some of it's mathematical theory, but some of it's philosophical theory, and a lot of it has to do with sort of managing teams as well. There's so much going on here, which is we're edging towards talking about complexity here. But just before we move on, it's so interesting. I wanted to talk to you a little bit about sort of pushing yourselves hard and things like that, because I remember years ago I had a French friend who was into F1. And I was not. And I was like, what could possibly be so interesting about cars driving? And he said, what you don't understand is that every single element of it is competitive. They compete for the engineering teams, every single member of it. There's, as you say in some of the talks that I'll link to, in the show notes for this on YouTube, there's thousands of parts. Each part has a team behind it, competing to make the best part, but then they all have to come together, and it has to work as a car. But then behind that, you have people running simulations during the race based on what's happened so far. Maybe one tire's sort of elevation is mismatching another one. When are we going to decide to go into the pit? Things like that. It's just incredible. And I was just wondering if you could maybe talk for a moment of what the dynamic was like for you on the software side of things on race day.
Look, that was a nice sensation. You felt the competition in everything you did. You were competing against time and competing against the other team in every activity that you were doing. And the structure inside the Ferrari while I was there was pretty flat, so you had the opportunity to suggest any idea, anything that could help to go faster. At the same time, there was a lot of pressure, so you had freedom, but also pressure, and you were thinking about what you could do in order to go faster in terms of your work, but also not to screw up and make things worse. So it was like, there's no budget limit, there is only time limit, and everything that you can think about, we could try to do it. And you got this infinite sense of possibility, and you start to think outside the box, and you try that. You have a sense of responsibility and a sense of excitement. There is a lot of very competent people, and then you learn extremely quickly. Formula One is fast. You had, at the time that I was working on it, you had 1-2 test event every week, one race. And so you have a lot of reality checkpoint that you cannot escape. Every test, every race, throw the reality in your face. You cannot hide, you cannot procrastinate, you cannot present a Gantt chart, you cannot do a PowerPoint presentation, you cannot say we will set up a committee and we will study what is the problem and we will come back to you. No, the reality hit your face, 200 kilometers per hour, you have to react and try to do the right thing. And that was incredibly exciting. And the other element, it's the pinnacle of a motorsport. It's a worldwide competition. Every millisecond matter. And you are working in a situation that is unbelievable. I didn't have a life, honestly, during those years. It was just fighting hard like an athlete, going to run for the Olympic. And but that was a brain Olympic for me. It was software and people and teams and race engineers working with them. Uh, it was really exciting.
That you really communicated the excitement there. You're reminding me of I had a period of my life where I had no life because I mean I was working in mergers and acquisitions in the city in London, near where you are in Canary Wharf right now, and I mean that was like there was no race per se, but there were time limits, and it was competitive. Like you knew there were other people also working 20-hour days, trying to get to the best bid basically. And the I think there's probably an analogy to what you were doing, where like it's you have to be incredibly inventive. It's not just putting in the time. It's not just kind of being smart, but like in sort of I remember working in on a deal that was for underground petrochemical storage in Germany, which something that actually became news when the war in Ukraine started. If you could establish a connection with a local chemical plant to use the water the salt water that comes out from mining a salt cavern underground, then you can build a new revenue stream, which means now you can make a higher bid for the company that you're trying to acquire. And like just that kind of thing, like there's just endless possibility for when
Yeah,
you're competing in these kinds of ways.
that sense of infinite possibilities, and that it depends on what you are going to do. And the smart people that you have around, the pressure, the deadline, the frequent deadline that keep you in touch with the reality. The tire is touching the ground, the tarmac. You are not just fantasizing or philosophizing. It is there. And it makes things powerful. You mentioned Farley before. We started to introduce some of the practices related to continuous delivery before the book was published, but it was the constraint, the environment, the people help us to go in that direction. And it's exciting. And I remember that exciting at the beginning of the personal computing revolution, at the beginning of the internet revolution. I feel that now in IE and in some work environment, like the two examples that we just discussed, you were living it every minute, every second of the day. What a memories! Thank you
Yeah,
for
yeah,
bringing
no, and
that back.
it's and I guess that leads me just to the last maybe the last thing I'll ask directly about that experience working on the Ferrari F1 team. Was there burnout, or was everybody just really just into it in the way that you obviously were?
Yeah, look, it was an easy time. We were winning, and we were winning a lot. I was there just after Barrichello left, Massa, Schumacher, Kimi Raikkonen, and I helped the preparation of the season for Alonso. So I was there in a time where we had many victories. We won many races, many championships. We worked very hard, extremely hard. I remember for Monte Carlo, there was a special feature that was needed only there. We worked around a lot of hours doing pair programming for, I don't know, 16 hours. Still, when you win the race Sunday, and you step in Monday after having win and everyone congratulating you, all your boss or your coworker, not people outside, that's different, that's entertainment, but your coworker, your boss, everyone, you felt like it was nothing. You were fresh. That win completely reset everything. And I cannot understand how it worked, but it was like that. It was like that. We didn't have any burnout. We didn't know. My ex-coworker that are still working there, now they're doing an hard job. It was easy for me. We were winning. Everyone was praising us. And as I told you, every Monday was like fresh energy. They're doing an hard work to get back there and start winning again. So I think they are the good one. I was just enjoying a run of fame, a tour of fame, but they are the ones that are preparing the next success. So
that's a really charitable way of looking at it, and I think a very hard-nosed way of looking at what the nature of a challenge is, and different kinds of challenges. Just moving on to talk now about to the next part of the interview, where we talk about your book and your books, actually, in this case, because you have a previous book called Living Complexity that you published on Leanpub as well. So now people, if this is the first podcast they've ever watched or listened to about programming, might think, oh my God, what an incredibly exciting job to have. This is not always the case. And this is notoriously not always the case. And there's something you talk about the history of programming, starting with the Industrial Revolution, and there's various formulations of the progressive history and in terms of technology and things like that. But there was something that the sort of agile revolution that we've already talked about a little bit, with this starting in the early 2000s kinds of thing, was a reaction to something, and it was a reaction to essentially the kind of application of processes from basically car manufacturing in the early 20th century to programming. I'm leaving a lot out of the story, but just to tell something so that people are familiar, you had Henry Ford come up with a assembly line kind of thing. These practices were in their own terms extremely successful, and then people tried to apply them to different kinds of work, like programming, for example. And I actually didn't know about some of the specific things that you mentioned in your book, the rational unified process and the software compatibility maturity model.
So crashing things.
Yeah, so we've started with all the excitement and the literal kind of rush, but let's talk about the soul crushing things now. What was the rational unified process and the software capability maturity model, and what was wrong with them?
So, in a sense, there is nothing wrong with them. If you think about the combustion engine, if you think about modern medicine, chips, they were all brought to us with that way of thinking. So in a sense, you can say there's nothing wrong with that. Point is that they were born at the time when the world were very slow. And they were born to deal with goods and products that were commoditized and mass-produced and standardized. When you're dealing with that type of product, that type of thinking is perfect. You want to do the same thing again and again in a very repeatable way. Everything is predictable. You can know in advance what kind of problem you may have, what is the probability, how to handle that. You can bake any mistake into the business model. You can describe processes that will deal with that and optimize things. And in that situation, the human is the weak link. What we want is that everyone doing that work behave like a semi-automated robot. Do not think, execute exactly without variation. And it helped us win World War II. So that's not really bad. In a sense, it works. But there is also a different type of reality that is innovation or exploration. When you're setting your first foot on the unknown, you push the envelope, you cross the boundary of the known, and you step into the unknowns. And the only way to make the path there is by walking it. And that's a completely different world. The rule of physics of that world completely changed. And what was working before stopped working later. What we are talking about, and that's why we can call it soul crashing in a sense, this type of exploration is what require your creativity, your courage, your curiosity. And that's the extremely fun part of working, when work become a passion and a joy. But for many centuries, people had to work just to eat and to survive. Uh, we have been lucky. I've been lucky. I've been part of one of the first generation in the personal computing revolution that made intellectual work something that was kind of standard and for everyone. We are all knowledge, most of us nowadays are knowledge workers, creative people, and we bring our humanity in the work that we do, and we uh, gain joy and realization from our job. But that's not always been there, and it's a completely different way of thinking and of working.
Yeah, that's so well said, and it's interesting that one thing I read about in your book that when people sort of get into this kind of thing, they might read about like the Toyota model and things like that, and we might start thinking about sort of processes to increase productivity and stuff like that. But a very important part of it is making a place where the people can flourish and feel like they're flourishing, and not be themselves treated like as a recent podcast guest pointed out to me that Henry Ford once complained that like these pairs of hands had to come with brains attached. And when you sort of embrace that brain that's attached to it, there's actually so much more that you can open up that you can do, and keeping in mind that humanity. But when you now sort of have that humanity happening, you have a conscious being that has agency and things like that, and then that brings with it in the organization there's the innovation side of things, there's exploring new things that bring unpredictability, but having a collection of independent agents just brings with it a certain kind of inherent unpredictability as well, at least in the sort of normal linear sense, which is where the complexity thinking comes in.
Yeah, because when you need the people that bring their talent and make the gift of their talent to the organization every day in order to innovate, to create, to do what organization need to do to stay ahead, you have the human element and become important, the human and social element and emotional element and the drive and the motivation. You were briefly mentioning before the example of the Formula One car. There are thousands of parts, and behind every part there is a department. But all those parts, in order to produce a winning Formula One car, they do not only need to be perfect individually in an isolation, but they need to work together in the best possible way. And these require trade-off across multiple individual departments and parts of the car. So the technical and social element come together, creating a complexity, a technical complexity, a language complexity, because there's people from different background, the social complexity, emotional. And when you're dealing with these and with the novelty of exploring new technology and new solution, things become unpredictable. There's no certainty. You need to become comfortable with uncertainty. You need to become comfortable in exploring the unknown, to let things happen, to learn on your way, to gradually evolve, but also to prepare yourself to react, to make things reversible, to be adaptable, and so on. So it's a mix of human and science coming together to make the most of the human element.
One image you bring up right at the beginning of your book is the fact that we can predict where a planet's going to be 400 years from now, but we can't predict when a project is going to finish. And that's I love that, because it captures sort of what you're talking about here. There's this sort of fundamental categorical difference between certain kinds of things. And so I think often, and a lot of these soul-crushing kind of ways of doing things are there to kind of force that predictability into a situation. And as you say, there are some situations where you can do that, where you ought to do that, where you might even have a duty and an obligation to do that, and to just sort of let your humanity kind of go for, at least with respect to that work. But there's other kinds of work where it's required. And in those cases, what you don't do is you don't try and predict outcomes. What you try and do, from what I understand from your work, is you try and come up with processes that are more likely to have the outcome that you want. So it's a sort of likelihood of success rather than predictability and timing that's important.
Yeah, not only likelihood. Think about this. This is an extreme case, extreme uncertainty. Think about that. I'm gonna ask you what is the probability to get a 6 if I roll a dice. Okay, we can get to the right answer. But imagine that the number of faces of the dice is constantly changing. So how can you calculate the probability? You don't even know the probability space to make the math behind that. And when humanity and life has a part on it, we are in that situation where the future is unpredictable. And what else? There was something. Oh yes, was something I wanted to say. I think an important question would be why nowadays we are still talking about those way of working that are predictable coming from the assembly line, why people and most of the organization hasn't adopted this new way of thinking. Point is that the old way of thinking has been successful for many, many years. A school things that they teach us are more similar, like calculating where a planet will be in 400 years. And when we go into organizations, that's what we learn. We learn to work still in the traditional way. The new way of thinking is more recent, but is also uncomfortable. So there are things related to complexity that are perfectly comfortable to human beings, emotionally mature human beings. Think about how many awkward social situations you have to deal with a lot of ambiguity, things that you don't know. Think about how many emotionally difficult situation you have to deal with friends and relationships and mixed feelings and try to come up with a decision with all those mixed feelings. Well, it's not easy, but we get to do it and we get to do it well. Think about how many difficult situations in life happens. People that change job, move to a different continent. We were talking before. Sometimes they have some difficult event in their life and they find the strength to come out of it. All those complexity, social and human complexity, we deal well with it. We are good at doing that. But there is another element of complexity that our human element derail us. We feel bad. We need control. We feel a need of control. Most of us feel a need of certainty. We are not happy with ambiguity. We get anxious when we don't know what is going to happen. If someone tells us, look, there is no one riding your train now, we feel very, very bad about that. And we get very easily tricked by a very coherent and simple narrative that we want to believe, like the hero, the leader, the history that was written because the good always win. When we realize how many things happen in our life by chance or by the contribution, the multitude of contribution of a lot of different people coming together randomly at the right time in the right place, that make us feel uncomfortable. So all these aspects of dealing with complexity require a method and a learning that thinking because they were not come natural to us, and that's the difficult part.
Yeah, this is something I was really looking forward to talking to you about, and I'm not exactly sure how to frame it, but like this you talk very movingly about the sort of attractiveness of these simple narratives for explaining things around us, these kind of, reductive causal kind of structures. Oh, it was a great genius that did it, or it was the great leader that did it. And this is actually the way a lot of us sort of first learn about human history and things like, and even about the way things work. And the way I want to get into this, and hopefully I'll come up with a good question at the end, but the way the reason the scientific method works is because the fundamental units are identical and the rules that apply to them are the same across space and time. So if I light a Bunsen burner under a beaker of water under the same conditions, it's going to start boiling after this like equivalent amount of energy has been introduced into that system over an equivalent amount of time, over an identical amount of time, under different, no matter where I do it or when I do it. And this just isn't true of the human system, like the human individual. It's just not the case that we are identical, and that you can do science on us in the same way that you can do science on, boiling water or something like that. And so now when you start saying things like that, there's a lot of people that go, no, that's just because you haven't tried hard enough. If only, well, we'll find that four-sided triangle if we just keep looking. And they think that you're giving up, or they think that you're being kind of loose in your thinking if you don't say, no, there's got to be some way that we can reproduce the scientific method over these human agents. And I always think of kind of like the ultimate act of reduction that was done in pursuit of this was in one of the introductions that Marx wrote to Capital, where he said, what I'm going to do is I'm going to treat individuals as personifications of forces in order to treat economic history as natural history. Now you have a science of history because I'm just a personification of some forces. And there's so many things that are interesting to do there, the roots in Hegel, things like that. But like the way we can hallucinate this simplicity into what's just obviously not like that all around us is something that I personally find incredibly fascinating. And like when you're talking to people about what complexity is, and you encounter this, I assume you sometimes encounter this pushback, like there's no complexity. It's actually simple if we just could find the right laws governing human behavior and psychology. What do you say to them to sort of convince them that this isn't a giving up, this is an embracing and a pushing forward on the problem?
Look, it's difficult. It is difficult, as it was difficult for me after studying computer science as a branch of math. Has been a very difficult personal journey that have to change the way that I behave, approach people, life. So it is difficult. What I do is try to bring examples of life that people may have been gone through. Like, for example, the difference between buying a t-shirt on Amazon and having a beautiful wedding dress made by a fashion designer, where you try to grow this dress with the designer, try a lot of different design material, and you don't know if you will manage to get it on time within your budget in a way that you like and in a way that make you look good. And we have similar things in life. Some of us build our home and customize everything. There are many experiences in life, children. Can you write a PowerPoint children to raise a children or to plan a children party? There are many things in life where we deal with that. So I try to bring those examples from our experience. Still, like you say, there are some fundamental pushback. There is always the belief that if you try harder, if you take the uncertainty out of the equation, it may work. But what we saw again and again is that it doesn't work. When we do it the other way, it works better, it wins, it's more effective, it's successful, and the other way fail and fail again. In the software industry at the beginning, we always had someone coming with a silver bullet idea. Oh, let me do this, it will work this time. No, if you push harder. Yeah, and I can tell you by experience, and you too, right? We know it will not work. So It's hard, and I try to bring examples that people can relate. And some other time, I just have to say, okay, this is not the right time for you. It will come later, as when it came for me at the right time.
Yeah, it's that's actually so well put about the right time. I'm thinking about I had a recent interview with Jeff Sutherland, who was one of the founders of Scrum, and he tells a few origin stories of Scrum, but one of them was trying to train fighter pilots in Vietnam, and he had a high rate of there was a high rate of crashes and even people dying, and it was basically because he was giving them the instruction to kind of like vary their flight path, so they knew where they were going, but most people would just fly straight at it, and so they became easy targets. And he just said, some people would rather die than change.
Yeah.
And I think, accepting that sometimes, like that's why I said it was so well put. It's like now is not the time, perhaps, for this person, instead of giving up on them, or on yourself, right? Because we like when I say that, like there's things about me that I don't want to change, and you need to reflect on that as well. Just moving on to the last part of the interview, where we talk about your experience as a writer. So you've written a couple of books now, and I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about your approach to that process, which is itself complex. Do you set aside? Are you mechanistic about it? Do you set aside like an hour a day at a specific time, or leave it to the weekend? How do you approach starting and completing a big writing project?
Well, to me, it's about following my creative process and my need to tell something. Sometimes I feel the need to tell a story. I feel I have the story in my mind perfectly clear. And then I have the illusion that I can write it down quickly. That is where it all starts. It always starts like that. Um, and then I face the first challenge, that is try to put this story down in a way that is linear. Think about that. I have that story in my mind like a network of connected things. But then you have to try to tell and communicate that story on a linear medium in a way that makes sense for other people, that is credible. You can back up what you are saying, and it's entertaining at the same time. So the first challenge is inside my mind, try to linearize that beautiful complex network of a story that I feel I have to tell. And it's a beautiful story, but is a network of stars in the skies connected between them. And so it starts there. And then I start to write it down, and I write it down as just as it came. So I could write it down on a Google Doc. It's imperfect, it's incomplete, it is what it is. But I try to reach the end of the first version of the book. So everything is short, is raw, is incomplete. And this is where my creative process starts. I have kind of a skeleton that is driven by what I have to say and what start to make sense on the page. And I try to get at the end very quickly of the first draft. This is just the start. It can take 1 week, 3 week, 4 weeks of hard work. But anyway, that's just the start. That's just the beginning. The hard work come later.
Yeah, no, that's so interesting. That's one of the sort of classic ways of doing it, which is very easy to describe, but sort of hard to live. When it's like just getting it down, just get it out, just get started. I love that image of the constellation, and then trying to transform that into a linear narrative, and the challenge that poses. So in the what comes after, obviously it's editing and reorganizing and things like that. Do you get feedback from people while you're
Oh,
in the raw state?
absolutely. So most of the work is after the first version. The initial draft is like maybe no, it is an important part, but is the iterative approach that follow the first version. I invite early readers to read even the initial draft and to give feedback, and I understand what is clear, what is not, what is missing, what makes sense. Myself, I start to do research because in my mind, I know what I can trust, what not, what can be possibly demonstrated, or if that demonstration doesn't work, I know there are 3 other paths of demonstrating that. But when you're writing it down, you have to be precise about what you're writing. So I have to do my research, my refinement, and the book started gradually to emerge. The topics and the tables start to take shape. I have to make decision how deep or not I want to go on something, and how to make something interesting and entertaining, and how much to be specific and correct on something. Now, to be clear, this is just my creative process. I'm not suggesting anyone that there is anything good in that, but that's how my brain works. And so then I started to publish it incrementally. So even if it is a draft and I start early to get feedback, I start an incremental publishing for another round of readers that are potentially interested on something better formed. And there I go incrementally 1 chapter at the time, and I ask again feedback, how much I can process it and improve it. And I keep until the end of the first version of the book, but that's not even the end of it. That's still just the beginning. Then I start to talk to people about my book. People ask you, what is your book about? And I have to wonder, okay, how would they say that in 5 minutes? What is really my book about? I have so many things to tell. Or I have to write a presentation, or I have to do an interview. And I start to look at my book in different things. Some more dots connect, some more key points become more evident, and I refine it again and again. And I do a second version of the book. Then I present it more, and more version and more things comes up. For example, my first book is organized in 3 parts that I call regions. I realized that after the first version, it's a catalog of different practices. But then I started to realize that there are 3 different regions. One that is about the self and human self-organization. One that it is about assessing the degree of complexity and adapting to it. And one that is about the complexity at the level of the whole organization. But the fact that I have these 3 groups of practices become evident much later. So the book really emerged. And talking with people and putting myself on the other side as a reader helped me to do this gradual refinement. In the first book, I did 4 refinement, 4 version, 4 edition before I could say now is ended. So I love this iterative, I love the freedom of my creative process, that I could follow it without being constrained, and the possibility of iterate with a book that feels alive until I feel it's finished. Because with the book that I did before, I finish a book, I publish it, and then I start to realize, oh, now I would like to change it completely, but it was too late.
Yeah, that's such a great description of such a great process, and it's so I love the way that there's always there's sort of, and that's just the beginning, and that's just the beginning, and I think everyone who's ever published anything knows that the moment you sort of, let's say it's done, you're like, I wish I'd done it differently, or I wish I'd done something else, and then you're on to the next project. Um, uh, just in the interest of time, the last question I always like to ask on the podcast, if the guest is an author on Leanpub, is if there was one magical feature we could build for you, or if there was one thing that you always been shaking your fist at Leanpub, going, "Damn you, Leanpub, why don't you fix this?" If there was one thing like that we could build for you, or one thing like that we could fix for you, can you think of anything that you would ask us to do?
Yeah, I will say a feature to add that I find missing is a search feature that allow me to search on the old book and not on individual chapters. So, for example, If I say self-organization, can I find all the chapters and all the places where I talk about self-organization? That would be great. Now I can only, with the way that I'm using Leanpub, I can only search inside the individual chapters. So that will be the only thing that I have missing.
Yeah, no, that's a really great suggestion. For some people who might be surprised, how can it be that you can't search a book? So some Leanpub books are written in plain text, in sort of in GitHub, sort of repos and stuff like that. So or on Dropbox, well, obviously you can search those things. But if you write in our browser writing mode, we have some really cool features, but they're chapter by chapter. If you're writing in our browser writing mode, you create chapters, and you can kind of think of them as like separate web pages, I guess. It's not exactly right, but you can think of them that way. And we currently don't have a facility for searching across all of them when you're in the browser writing mode. So I'll definitely communicate that one to the team because, I mean, I'm sort of surprised it's the first time anyone's brought it up, but what could be more obvious feature than that? Well, Luca, thank you very much for taking some time out of your evening to talk to me and to talk to our audience. And thank you very much for using Leanpub as one of the platforms for writing and publishing your books.
A real pleasure for both. Thank you very much, Lee.